Welcome back to your channel LeOo Storyland. Here we uncover real Reddit stories. If you liked my video, please like, share, subscribe.
My name is Rachel Morgan, and the moment my brother-in-law laughed at my Navy career, his own uncle slammed his bourbon onto the table and barked, "Apologize, right now." Every conversation in the room died instantly. No one moved. You know those moments when a house that's been full of chatter suddenly becomes so quiet you can hear the refrigerator humming? It was exactly like that. Kyle blinked at his uncle. "What?" he asked with a little laugh like he thought it had to be some kind of joke. Nobody laughed back. I wished someone would. Instead, every face around the dining room table slowly turned toward me. I wanted to disappear. Not because Kyle had embarrassed me. He'd been doing that for years. I wanted to disappear because Daniel Brooks had recognized something I'd spent most of my adult life trying not to advertise. He still hadn't taken his eyes off Kyle. I said, "Apologize." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The kind of authority that comes from 35 years in the Navy doesn't need volume. Kyle leaned back in his chair. For what she answered my question. Daniel looked at me. "Commander, would you like to handle this?" I forced a smile. "No, sir. Old habits. Even after all these years?" He nodded once and sat back down. But the room never recovered. Dinner continued with forced conversation that felt like everyone was reading from different scripts. I picked at the roasted chicken on my plate while Ethan gently squeezed my knee under the table. "You okay?" he whispered. "I will be." I wasn't lying. I just knew tonight wasn't over. 3 hours earlier, the evening had started like every other family gathering. Ethan and I left our townhouse in Norfolk just after 1 o'clock. The drive to Richmond usually took about 90 minutes unless traffic backed up around Williamsburg. We stopped at Buc-ee's because Ethan insisted nobody made better beef jerky. He also bought a ridiculously oversized soda that barely fit in the cup holder. "You know Kyle's going to say something," he said as we got back on Interstate 64. "I know. You don't have to let him." "I usually don't," he sighed. "My parents should have shut this down years ago." "They don't like conflict. They don't like conflict unless it's directed at you." I couldn't argue with that. His family had never quite figured me out. To them I was polite, quiet, always working, always missing holidays because I was on assignment. They assumed that meant paperwork somewhere, human resources, logistics, maybe recruiting. I never corrected them. My job required discretion. More importantly, I liked living without people making assumptions. Ironically, they made assumptions anyway. Olivia's engagement dinner was held at Ethan's parents' home in Richmond's West End. The neighborhood was full of brick colonials built in the 90s. Freshly cut grass, American flags, kids riding bicycles even though the July heat made everyone sweat before they reached the mailbox. Inside, Linda, my mother-in-law, greeted us with a hug. "Rachel, you made it. Wouldn't miss it." She meant that. Linda was kind. Her biggest flaw was that she believed keeping the peace meant never correcting her oldest son. Kyle was already standing in the kitchen holding a local IPA and telling a story that somehow involved closing another luxury SUV sale. He noticed us. "Look who finally showed up." Ethan rolled his eyes. "We're 5 minutes early." "Military punctuality, huh?" Kyle grinned. "Guess that's all that government training." I smiled politely. "It's nice to see you too." He laughed like we'd shared a joke. That's how it always worked. He'd throw a little jab. If I ignored it, he'd act like we were having fun. If I answered back, I suddenly became the difficult one. After nearly 8 years in this family, I'd learned silence usually cost less. Dinner started around 6. Olivia looked genuinely happy. Her fiancé Michael seemed like a good man, easygoing, respectful. His uncle Daniel had flown in from Annapolis for the engagement. I'd never met him before. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Daniel Brooks." "Rachel Morgan." His eyes lingered just a second longer than most people did. Not suspicious, observant. Military people notice little things. The faint tan line where a watch usually sits. The way someone automatically scans exits. Posture. Hands. I noticed him noticing. Then we both moved on. Halfway through dinner, Kyle started. "So, Rachel, here we go. Still in the Navy?" "Yes." "What is it now, 15 years?" 16. "Dang." He took a sip of beer. "They really know how to keep people around." A few people chuckled. Then came another question. So what exactly do you do these days? I work with leadership development. Not technically a lie. Not the whole truth either. Kyle frowned. Sounds boring. It has its moments. He smirked. I always picture Navy people with cool stories. I've got a few. You probably have one of those military nicknames too. I shrugged. Sometimes. What is it? The table quieted. I don't know why I answered. Maybe because after years of avoiding questions I got tired. Maybe because I assumed nobody there would recognize it. Mad Dog. I reached for my iced tea. Before it touched my lips I heard glass hit wood. Daniel had frozen. His bourbon sat untouched. He stared directly at me. Not surprised. Recognizing. Then his eyes shifted toward Kyle. Apologize. Kyle laughed. For asking a question. Daniel's expression didn't change. You have no idea who you're speaking to. Kyle actually smiled wider. Oh, come on, Uncle Dan. No. Daniel's voice stayed calm. You apologize because respect should come before curiosity. The room went silent. Michael looked confused. Olivia stared between them. Linda stopped serving mashed potatoes. Even Ethan looked surprised. I wanted to stop it. Really, I did. Master Chief, I said quietly, it's okay. He looked at me. No, Commander. His tone softened. It isn't. Kyle finally realized nobody else was smiling. What is everybody's problem? Daniel folded his napkin with deliberate care. The problem, he said, is that you just mocked someone whose service has earned more respect than you'll probably ever understand. Nobody spoke. Kyle looked at me. Then back at Daniel. His confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. What are you talking about? Daniel simply picked up his glass again. You'll find out when she's ready. He took a slow sip. And for the first time in all the years I'd known my brother-in-law, Kyle had absolutely nothing to say. The drive back to Norfolk that night was quieter than any trip Ethan and I had taken in years. The only sound inside the SUV was the soft hum of the tires on Interstate 64 and the occasional weather report coming from the radio before Ethan turned the volume down. Neither of us knew where to begin. About 20 minutes outside Richmond, he finally spoke. I've never seen Uncle Daniel like that. I kept my eyes on the dark highway. Neither have I. He called you Commander. That's my rank. He glanced at me. I know that's your rank. What I don't know is why a retired Master Chief looked like he'd just seen a ghost. I smiled faintly. He didn't see a ghost. Then what? A memory. Ethan rested one hand on the steering wheel. You don't have to tell me if you can't. I know. That was one of the reasons I'd married him. He could be curious without making curiosity feel like a demand. After another mile or two, I reached over and squeezed his arm. I'm sorry. For what? For putting you in the middle of all this. You didn't. My job did. He shook his head. No. He looked over at me. Kyle did. Monday morning arrived like every other Monday. At 6 o'clock, I was already running along the Elizabeth River Trail. Humidity wrapped around Norfolk like a damp blanket. A retired couple walked their Labrador. Two sailors in Navy PT gear jogged past me. The smell of salt water drifted in from the harbor. Routine had always helped me think. Every difficult deployment, every loss, every impossible decision. Running cleared the noise, but Kyle kept finding his way back into my thoughts. Not because he'd embarrassed me. I'd learned years ago not to measure myself by someone else's opinion. What bothered me was Daniel. He had recognized my nickname immediately. There were fewer people than most would imagine who even knew it. Most of the sailors I'd served with simply called me Rachel. Mad Dog belonged to a different chapter of my life, one I rarely revisited. By 8 o'clock, I was inside my office on Naval Station Norfolk. The building wasn't impressive. Gray walls, government furniture, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. Exactly the kind of place where people assumed nothing important happened. I liked it that way. Lieutenant Melissa Carter knocked lightly on my door. Morning, ma'am. Morning. She carried a stack of leadership evaluations. Captain Reynolds moved tomorrow's mentoring session to this afternoon. Thanks. She hesitated. You okay? I looked up. What makes you ask? You've reorganized the same folder 3 times. I laughed. I guess I'm easier to read than I thought. Only if someone works for you, she smiled. Family. She nodded knowingly. I'll pretend I didn't ask. Just before lunch, my phone buzzed. It was the Morgan family group chat. Kyle had posted a meme, a cartoon dog wearing navy camouflage. Underneath it, he'd written, "Watch out, everybody, Mad Dog is coming." Laughing emojis followed. His wife added one. A couple of cousins clicked the thumbs up button. Then came another message. Guess Hollywood's making Top Gun 3. Rachel's probably the star. More laughing emojis. I stared at the screen. Melissa walked into my office. You look like you're deciding whether to throw your phone into the Chesapeake. Tempting. She glanced down. I shouldn't. You shouldn't. I locked the screen without replying. Some arguments aren't worth winning. That evening, Ethan found me watering the tomato plants behind our townhouse. He held up his own phone. I saw the group chat. I figured. I'm calling him. No. He crossed the line. He crossed it years ago. So why let him keep doing it? I turned off the hose. Because every time someone argues with Kyle, he somehow becomes the victim. That doesn't make it right. I know. He sighed. I hate that you feel like you have to tolerate it. I don't tolerate it. I looked at the little green tomatoes beginning to grow. I simply choose where to spend my energy. 3 days later, an unfamiliar Maryland number appeared on my phone. I answered. Rachel. Commander Morgan? I'd recognize Daniel's voice anywhere. Good afternoon, Master Chief. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. There was a pause. I owe you an apology. I frowned. For what? I put you in an uncomfortable position. You were defending me. I also exposed something you've clearly tried to keep private. I leaned back in my chair. You couldn't have known. I suspected. How? He chuckled softly. Nobody forgets that nickname. I closed my eyes for a second. I was hoping they had. They haven't. Daniel invited me to lunch the following Saturday at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the Severn River in Annapolis. He arrived wearing jeans, a polo shirt. He looked less intimidating than he had at dinner. Still sharp. Still observant. We ordered crab cakes. After the waitress walked away, he folded his hands. I served with men who served under you. I laughed. Now you're making me sound ancient. You know what I mean? I do. He smiled. They all told the same story. That's dangerous. They said if things went wrong, he stopped. They wanted Mad Dog making the decisions. I looked out across the water. They remembered the good parts. They also remembered the hard parts. I didn't answer. Daniel lowered his voice. I know about Lieutenant Harris. My stomach tightened. Even after 6 years, hearing that name still hurt. He wasn't your fault. I signed the operation order. You also saved 14 others. I couldn't save 15. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he let the silence sit between us. Sometimes that's kinder than trying to fix someone else's grief. On the drive home, memories I usually kept locked away returned without permission. The nickname hadn't come from being fearless. It hadn't come from being aggressive. It certainly hadn't come from enjoying combat. It started after one miserable night in the North Arabian Gulf. A boarding operation had gone sideways. Visibility was terrible. Communications failed. Several sailors were trapped. Command wanted everyone pulled back. I went anyway. Twice. One of the younger sailors later joked that I was too stubborn to know when to quit. Another called me Mad Dog. The name spread faster than I could stop it. People remembered the rescue. I remembered the one person we couldn't bring home. Nicknames have a strange way of preserving only part of the truth. The following Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another family message, this time from Linda. Everyone's coming over next month for Labor Day. Hope you two can make it. Before I could respond, Kyle added one more comment. Maybe Mad Dog can tell us some war stories. For the first time all week, I almost answered. Almost. Instead, I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Outside, Ethan was washing his old pickup truck. The sun was beginning to set over the neighborhood. Life felt peaceful, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to stay that way for much longer. Labor Day weekend arrived with the kind of late summer heat that seems determined to remind Virginians that fall is still just a promise. By Friday afternoon, Naval Station Norfolk had started emptying out. Sailors headed home for long weekends. Traffic crawled through the gates. Families loaded coolers into pickup trucks, kids waving little American flags left over from a neighborhood parade. I had every intention of spending the weekend doing absolutely nothing. Mow the lawn. Change the oil in Ethan's truck. Maybe grill burgers Sunday evening. Normal sounded wonderful. Instead, my phone rang just after 3. The caller ID read Daniel Brooks. Rachel. Commander, I told you to call me Daniel. I've been in the Navy too long. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his tone changed. I need to ask you something. I'm listening. I'd like you to attend next Friday's leadership recognition ceremony at Norfolk. I frowned. I'm already scheduled to be there. I know. You don't usually call people about events they're already attending. No. There was a pause. I'd like your family there. I immediately understood where this was going. No. You didn't even let me finish. I don't need to. They should know who you are.
They already do.
No, he said gently. They know who they imagine you are. That evening, I told Ethan while we were making dinner. He was slicing bell peppers for fajitas. So Uncle Daniel invited everybody. Apparently. What did you say? I said no. He nodded. I figured. I stirred onions in the skillet. I don't want this becoming some kind of lesson for Kyle. What if it's bigger than Kyle? It isn't. It might be. I looked at him. For 16 years, you've hidden every accomplishment because you didn't want attention. I don't like attention. I know. He leaned against the counter. But there's a difference between being humble and allowing people to rewrite who you are. His words stayed with me long after dinner. Saturday morning, Daniel drove down from Annapolis. Instead of calling first, he simply knocked on our front door carrying a white bakery box. Peace offering, he said. Inside were fresh cinnamon rolls. You came all the way from Maryland with pastries. I know my audience. Ethan laughed and invited him in. An hour later, the three of us sat on the back patio while cicadas buzzed from the trees. Daniel finally explained. The ceremony isn't about medals. I know. It's about leadership. I know that too. They're recognizing officers who've shaped the next generation. I sighed. Daniel? He held up one hand. Hear me out. When I retired, I thought promotions made leaders. He smiled. I was wrong. What changed your mind? I met sailors who served under you. I looked down at my coffee. They all said the same thing. They're too generous. They said you remembered birthdays. I blinked. They said you learned the names of spouses and children. They're exaggerating. They said after Hurricane Florence you spent your own leave helping junior sailors rebuild flooded homes. I hadn't thought about that week in years. It didn't seem remarkable. People needed help. We helped, Daniel continued. They also said something else. I waited. They trusted you. He didn't rush the silence. In the Navy, he said quietly, that's a bigger compliment than bravery. I still refused, at least until Tuesday. That afternoon, Captain Reynolds stopped by my office. He closed the door behind him. Commander. Sir, I've got a favor to ask. Depends on the favor. He smiled. I hear you're trying to skip Friday's recognition. I wouldn't call it skipping. I would. I laughed. Who told you? Let's just say retired Master Chiefs have an alarming number of friends. I rubbed my forehead. So everybody's involved now. Looks that way. He became serious. Rachel, sir, how many mentoring sessions have you led? I don't know. Hundreds. Probably. How many officers have you recommended for command? I've never counted. And how many stayed late helping sailors whose marriages were falling apart or whose kids were sick? I shrugged. That's part of the job. No. He looked directly at me. That's part of your character. He stood. You've spent your career making sure other people received credit. He reached the door before turning around. Friday is the Navy returning the favor. Meanwhile, Kyle had no idea any of this was happening. He was still busy being Kyle. Wednesday evening, he posted pictures on social media from a luxury dealership event in Short Pump. Designer suit, sports car, caption, success looks good. My phone buzzed a few minutes later. Another family message. Kyle again. Who's coming to Mom's after the ceremony Friday? Then another. Rachel, maybe wear your dress uniform. It'll make for good pictures. A laughing emoji followed. Before I could decide whether to ignore it, Daniel answered. She always represents the Navy well. You should worry about representing yourself. The group chat went silent. Not one person replied. For once, Kyle didn't either. Friday morning dawned clear and bright. By 7:30, I was buttoning my service dress uniform. The mirror reflected someone I recognized professionally but rarely saw at home. Rows of ribbons, command insignia, years condensed into pieces of colored fabric and polished metal. Ethan adjusted my collar. You look incredible. I look uncomfortable. He smiled. Also true. The drive to Naval Station Norfolk felt strangely familiar and strangely different. I'd driven through these gates thousands of times. Today, however, 2 additional vehicles followed us. Kyle and his wife, Linda and Frank, Olivia and Michael. Daniel rode with them. When everyone gathered outside the auditorium, Kyle whistled. I've never actually seen you dressed like this. I smiled politely. Most people haven't. He looked around at the officers walking across the courtyard. Pretty big event. It usually is. He leaned closer. So what happens? Mostly speeches. He laughed. Sounds exciting. It usually isn't. Inside the auditorium, nearly 400 sailors, officers, and family members filled the seats. Flags stood behind the stage. A Navy band quietly played patriotic music while people found their places. Kyle whispered loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. I bet Rachel's hoping nobody asks her to speak. I pretended not to hear. The ceremony began precisely at 9. The commanding admiral entered. Everyone stood. After the national anthem, the admiral walked across the front row greeting distinguished guests. Halfway across the room, he suddenly changed direction. Instead of continuing toward the stage, he walked directly toward me. He smiled broadly, extended his hand. Commander Morgan. I stood. Good morning, Admiral. It's good to see you again. The honor is mine, sir. Around us, conversation stopped. Kyle's smile disappeared. The Admiral continued chatting casually for nearly a minute before moving on. Then another captain stopped. Then a command master chief. Then 2 commanders. Each greeted me by name. Each thanked me for something. Each moved on. By the time the ceremony officially began, my brother-in-law wasn't whispering anymore. He was simply staring at me, looking as though he'd just realized he had spent years laughing at someone he had never truly bothered to know. If you'd asked me afterward what the Admiral said during the first 10 minutes of the ceremony, I couldn't have told you. I was too aware of Kyle sitting 3 seats to my left. Not because I wanted to see his reaction, because I didn't. I kept my eyes on the stage, my hands folded neatly in my lap, trying to disappear into a room where disappearing was no longer an option. The ceremony moved through several awards first. A chief petty officer recognized for community service. A commander retiring after 30 years. A civilian employee honored for mentoring military families. Each applause felt genuine. This wasn't the kind of event people attended for excitement. It was about recognizing years of quiet work that rarely made headlines. I preferred it that way. When the Master of Ceremonies announced the final recognition, I felt my stomach tighten. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's program, Admiral Hastings has requested the opportunity to recognize an officer whose influence reaches far beyond any single command. I looked down. Daniel had warned me there might be a surprise. He hadn't mentioned this. The Admiral stepped back to the podium. Some leaders are remembered because of the positions they hold. He paused. Others are remembered because they change people. The large screen behind him lit up with photographs. None of them were dramatic. No helicopters. No classified missions. No action shots. Just ordinary moments. Me sitting with a young sailor outside the chapel, helping a family unload furniture after a transfer, laughing with a group of ensigns during a leadership workshop, standing ankle-deep in floodwater, handing out bottled water after Hurricane Florence. I hadn't known anyone had taken those pictures. The Admiral smiled. Commander Rachel Morgan has spent 16 years reminding us that leadership is measured one person at a time. My name echoed through the auditorium. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then someone stood. A chief in the back. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, nearly every sailor in uniform was on their feet. The applause rolled across the room until it sounded almost like ocean surf. I stayed seated for one stunned moment before realizing everyone was looking at me. Slowly I stood. The ovation continued. I wished it wouldn't. After receiving the plaque, I walked to the microphone. Prepared speeches had never been my strength. I looked across the audience. My eyes landed on Ethan first. He smiled with tears already forming. Then Linda. She looked confused and proud. Frank kept blinking as though he were trying to reconcile the daughter-in-law he thought he knew with the woman standing on stage. Finally, I saw Kyle. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor. I cleared my throat. I don't really know what to say. A few people laughed softly. The truth is, none of us gets here alone. I glanced toward the sailors, seated together near the front. Every lesson I've ever taught was first taught to me by someone else. Another pause. And every mistake I've ever made reminded me that rank doesn't make you important. It makes you responsible. The room became still. I've been lucky enough to serve beside extraordinary people. I accept this recognition on behalf of all of them. I smiled. And if any of them are watching today, please stop taking pictures when I'm not looking. Laughter filled the auditorium. Even I laughed. The tension disappeared. Exactly what I'd hoped. Outside the auditorium afterward, families gathered beneath the shade of old oak trees. Children climbed on retired aircraft displayed near the entrance. People took photographs. Congratulations came from every direction. Several former sailors introduced me to their spouses. One young lieutenant hugged me so tightly I nearly dropped the plaque. You changed my career, ma'am. I didn't. You did. He smiled. You convinced me not to resign after my divorce. I remembered. Barely. We'd talked for maybe 45 minutes one rainy afternoon. To me, it had been one conversation. To him, apparently it had changed everything. Moments like that humbled me far more than any ceremony ever could. Kyle approached about 15 minutes later. He came alone. No audience. No dramatic scene. His hands stayed buried in his pockets. I owe you an apology. I nodded. You do? He swallowed. I've been a jerk. You have. I thought... He stopped. No. He shook his head. I never actually thought. That answer surprised me. It also sounded honest. He looked toward the parking lot before speaking again. I always figured you kept your job vague because it wasn't important. I know. I judged you because you didn't talk about promotions or money or titles. I know. I was wrong. I studied his face. For the first time since I'd met him 8 years earlier, his confidence wasn't gone. His arrogance was... There was a difference. I accept your apology. Relief flashed across his face. Then I added quietly, but acceptance doesn't erase history. His shoulders dropped. I understand. I hope you do. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. About a month later, Kyle called unexpectedly. Not a text. Not a group message. An actual phone call. I need a favor. I smiled to myself. There it was. My son. What about Tyler? He's talking about joining the Navy after high school. Okay. He wants to apply for one of the officer programs. I waited. I was wondering... Another pause. If you'd write a recommendation. I leaned back in my chair. Writing recommendations wasn't unusual. Writing one for a family member felt different. When's the deadline? 3 weeks. Has Tyler asked me himself? Silence. No? Then the answer is no. Kyle sounded surprised. Why? Because this isn't your application. It's his. I know. If Tyler wants my recommendation, he can call me. Another pause. And before I recommend anyone, I need to know who they are. 2 evenings later, my phone rang again. This time it was Tyler. His voice cracked with nervousness. Aunt Rachel. Hi, Tyler. I'm sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me. Dad said I should ask you myself. I was hoping you would. We talked for almost an hour. Not about grades. Not about athletics. Not about leadership positions. We talked about responsibility, long deployments, missing birthdays, making decisions when every option hurts someone. At the end, he asked quietly, "Do you think I'd be good enough?" I smiled. I think you're asking the right questions. That mattered more than any resume ever could. A week later, Daniel stopped by our house again. This time he brought no pastries, only a grin. I heard about Tyler. News travels fast. It does. He looked at me. You know why you refused Kyle. I wanted Tyler to earn it. Daniel nodded. Exactly, he smiled. That's why I recognized you the night of that dinner. I frowned. It wasn't because of your nickname. It wasn't. No. What was it then? He chuckled. It was the way you stayed respectful after someone tried to embarrass you. He looked toward the Chesapeake Bay shimmering beyond the marina. Anybody can win an argument. Very few people win without losing themselves. For the first time since that awkward family dinner, I realized the real lesson had never been for Kyle. It had been for me. Winter arrived gently that year, not with deep snow or icy roads, but with crisp mornings, bare oak trees, and the smell of fireplaces drifting through neighborhoods across southeastern Virginia. Life settled into something that finally felt ordinary again, which was exactly what I wanted. Every weekday still started the same way. My alarm went off at 5:15. Coffee brewed while I fed our golden retriever Murphy. I'd lace up my running shoes and head toward the Elizabeth River before sunrise. Some mornings I'd pass the same retired Navy veteran walking his beagle. We never exchanged more than a wave. Sometimes that's enough. By 7:30, I was usually at my desk answering emails before the day's meetings began. Nothing about my routine suggested anything remarkable. I preferred it that way. Recognition fades. Character shouldn't. The biggest surprise came from someone I never expected to change, Kyle. Not overnight. Real people don't transform because of one embarrassing afternoon. At first, the changes were almost invisible. He interrupted people less. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. During Thanksgiving dinner, when a cousin joked that one of the younger relatives would never survive military life, Kyle quietly replied, "You don't know what people are capable of." The room went silent for a second. Then the conversation moved on. I noticed. So did Ethan. On the drive home, he smiled. "I think my brother's growing up." I laughed. At 42, everybody has their own timetable. A few weeks later, Tyler drove to Norfolk by himself. He had just turned 18. He parked his old Honda Civic outside our townhouse and looked nervous enough to forget where he'd left his keys. Ethan opened the front door. "You made it?" "Yes, sir." "You don't have to call me sir." Tyler smiled awkwardly. "I've been practicing." We all laughed. The ice broke immediately. He spent the afternoon with me walking around the waterfront near Nauticus. He had a notebook full of questions, not about medals, not about secret missions, about leadership, about failure, about responsibility. "What was the hardest day you ever had?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, "The day I had to tell a sailor's parents their son wasn't coming home." He swallowed hard. "I don't know if I could do that." "I hope you never have to." We kept walking. A tugboat moved slowly across the harbor. Gulls circled overhead. "I always thought the military was about being fearless," he admitted. I smiled. "Fearless people are dangerous." He looked confused. "The people you want beside you are the ones who feel fear and still make the right decision." He wrote that down, then closed the notebook. "I don't think Dad ever told me that." "Your dad and I have lived very different lives." He nodded thoughtfully. "I think he's trying." "So do I." Just before Christmas, Tyler called again. "I got accepted into the scholarship interview." "Congratulations." "I couldn't have done it without your recommendation." "You earned that recommendation." "No," he laughed. "I earned the chance to ask for it." That made me smile. He understood. On New Year's Day, Ethan and I drove to Richmond for another family dinner. A year earlier, I probably would have invented an excuse to stay home. This time, I actually looked forward to it. Linda greeted us with her usual hug. Frank immediately asked Ethan for help fixing the backyard fence. Olivia and Michael had brought homemade pecan pie. Everything felt lighter. Kyle met me at the front door before anyone else. "I've got something for you." He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was an old black and white photograph. A young sailor stood beside an aircraft carrier sometime during the early 1970s. "Who's this?" I asked. "My dad." I looked closer. "I've never seen this picture." "There aren't many." Kyle smiled. "I found it while cleaning out the attic." He rubbed the back of his neck. I realized something. "What?" "I spent years talking about success." He glanced toward the photograph. "My father almost never talked about his." I looked at him. "Maybe that's where real confidence comes from." He nodded. "I think so." No speeches. No dramatic apology. Just two people standing standing in a hallway finally understanding each other. Sometimes that's enough. After dinner, Daniel called through video chat from Annapolis. He couldn't travel because his wife had come down with the flu. Everyone gathered around the dining room table to say hello. When he saw me, he grinned. "Commander." "Master Chief?" Kyle laughed. "You two are never going to stop doing that, are you?" Daniel shook his head. "Absolutely not." Then he looked at Tyler. "You still planning on joining us?" "Yes, sir." Daniel smiled proudly. "Good." He looked back at me. "I imagine you'll be keeping an eye on him." "I imagine I will," Tyler groaned. "Oh, great." The whole family laughed. It was probably the first time military service had become a source of connection instead of misunderstanding. A few months later, I was back at the waterfront before sunrise. The harbor looked exactly as it always had. Ships came and went. The tide kept moving. People started their day without realizing how many quiet acts of service happened around them. I thought about that dinner months earlier. If someone had told me then that the greatest change wouldn't be in my career but in my family, I wouldn't have believed them. I never wanted revenge in the way people usually imagine it. I didn't want to humiliate Kyle. I didn't want him to feel small. I simply wanted the chance to be seen as the person I really was. Ironically, that only happened after I stopped trying to prove anything. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see before. Respect isn't something you demand. It isn't something you buy. And it certainly isn't something you earn by talking the loudest in the room. Real respect grows slowly. One promise kept, one difficult decision, one act of kindness when nobody is watching. Over time, those quiet moments become a reputation that speaks long before you ever have to. I still answer to Mad Dog whenever an old shipmate calls. Not because it's a title I'm proud of, because it reminds me of the people who trusted me when things were difficult, and of the responsibility that came with that trust. Those memories matter far more than any nickname ever could. If this story reminded you that dignity often speaks more powerfully than pride, I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for spending your time with me today. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and earned justice, I hope you'll join me again for the next one.